Chapter 15. So this was her father's new homestead. Scylla was unimpressed. A dusty, old-fashioned wooden cabin, not even a metal shelter, sat on the top of a rise that was not quite a hill. A water pump, a power generator, a compost bin, and a storage chest lined one wall of the cabin, the only sign that anyone had lived here for years. There were no fences, no cattle, no crops, no droids, and not even any machinery. Here, the prairie seemed to be holding its breath. A stiff breeze combed the grasses, and low, broken, heavy clouds threatened rain even as the noontime sun blazed between them, but nothing made a sound. The nearest town was a mere shape on the horizon behind her. The eyes of the Republic watched her. She did not know how she knew that, but somehow she knew. And yet nobody was in sight. Wherever her foes were, they were content to stay hidden for now. She put a hand on the front door of the cabin. It occurred to her to kick the door open and make the most forceful entrance possible, or to ignite her lightsaber and slice the door off its hinges, but the prospect did not tempt her. There was something appealingly truce-like about the silence, and she did not want to break it. Inside was her father, seated on a metal crate with his hands on his knees, doing nothing. The years had affected him very little. He looked old, but then again, he had always looked old. He had the same sunken, ruddy eyes and hangdog expression she remembered. He defied her expectations only by not having a bottle in his hand. He looked up at Scylla and went still. For a few long, silent moments, he looked her up and down. He did not show fear, as Scylla hoped he would. His eyes did not even linger on the lightsaber. He only sighed pityingly. "Hey, Scylla," he said. "I'm sorry I haven't seen you in so long." There was a pause. Scylla threw open her arms. "Is that it? Is that all you have to say to me?" "There's a lot I want to say. I want to say I'm sorry, because I know I messed up. I want to say I love you, and none of what's happened in the last 8 years changes that." "Then you're blind." He shrugged. "I'm a dad. Guess it comes with the territory." He gestured to a chair across the room. "Want to sit down? Tell your old man what you've been up to?" "And why should I do that? This is a trap. I sense your fear and deceit." "I have nothing to do with it, I swear. The others want to trap you, but they don't know I'm here. I'm not trying to get you hurt. I'm trying to, I don't know, talk you down from the cliff, I guess. Look, I think I know what you want to do to me. You might as well hear me out first. You're already here, so why not?" Scylla said nothing. He was right. She had indeed come here to kill him, because after the ruin her life had become, she refused to be the only one who suffered for it, and he was the closest thing she had to an enemy. But still she listened. "So," he said, "you left Flatbird County. That means you found your own place to live?" "I have a home now." "Got any roommates?" "More colleagues than I can count, and every year I rise higher among them." "Do you get along? Kick back, go sit by the river, that sort of thing?" Scylla did not answer. "Aw, Scylla, you're still lonely, aren't you?" "What do you mean, still?" "You were always a lonely kid. You wanted to go out and play with the other kids and talk and do whatever else, but you always seemed to be mad at them for something." "I seem to recall being too busy with work, because the only support I had was a worthless deadbeat of a father." He did not flinch at those words. "Yeah, guilty as charged. But how about now? I mean, now you're full grown, you're healthy," she scoffed. "You got those fancy clothes, your own place to live. You look like a success to me, but I can tell you're still hurting." Scylla tried to think of things that gave her pride and pleasure. She tried to remember how it had felt, cutting down the initiate boy on the day she had earned her place as a Sith apprentice. She tried to remember the respect the other Sith had come to show her, the fear and awe and jealousy. She thought of Jamar, but that thought hit a wall as she remembered what it had come to. Then she hit on something good, a memory that was pure and wholesome. "I saw the sun rise on other worlds," she said. "I walked in jungle where the trees were almost too close together to move through, and where they extend as far as the eye can see. I stood on a floating derrick in a gas giant and peered into a pit that was thousands of clicks down. I saw a river that empties off a cliff so high that the water turns to mist before it reaches the ground. I tested myself against beasts that no one has ever heard of. I've seen wonders that you would never see even if you lived 100 lifetimes." He leaned forward. "Good, Scylla. I'm proud of you." His face fell again. "But are you happy?" She folded her arms. "I am feared." "Why would you want that?" "Intimidation is the only path to safety. Now that others fear me, they respect me, and they afford me a place where I belong. There is no other path. When the Sith found me, I was a discarded vagrant, feared by no one, and rejected by everyone." "I never rejected you." "And what good was that?" "Not much, but the grocery lady you used to work for, Gens. I talked to her, and you know what she said? She said she was sad that you robbed her. She wished she could have kept you on. And I never got the chance to tell you this, but I heard nothing but good things about you from the overseer back in your community service days. And the animal doctor, too, she missed you. Scylla, I think..." He worked up the nerve to say it. "I don't think they rejected you. I think you rejected them." "You blame me?" Scylla's fists clenched until they shook. "And what would you have had me do? Grind away until I died? I tried that, and I was left with nothing." "Other people supported you. We were rooting for you, and we would have helped you through. Besides, the things you've been up to since you've been gone, where's the future in it? I know you're living the high life now, but where is this going? These people, the Sith, they really will leave you with nothing." "They already have," came the unwelcome thought, but she brushed it aside. "You're mistaken if you think I enjoy this life, but the Sith offered me the chance to cut down anyone who would not show me respect. With the options I had, how could I possibly refuse?" "You've got a lot of power. It's not too late to use it to turn your life around." There was a strain in his voice. It was not the strain of lying, not exactly, but instead the strain of saying something false and trying to make himself believe it. Scylla shook her head. "It's always been too late. No one in all the galaxy would ever accept me." "Why not?" "What?" "You're beautiful and strong and willing to take risks. You explore and try new things. There's no reason you couldn't be loved." It sounded like a compliment, but it was not. It was an attack against the foundations she had built her life on. "You're trying to confuse me." "I know I failed you, Scylla, and I'm sorry, but I never stopped believing in you." Scylla hugged herself. Turmoil she hadn't felt in years was now resurfacing. She felt smaller, younger, weaker. He extended a hand. "Come on. We don't need to make this worse. Come home, Scylla." Her pain nearly forced her to tears. She honed it into a point. "Not on your life," she spat. "We don't have a choice." He glanced nervously out the window. "If you don't come home with me, bad things will happen. Do you understand me?" "Not on your life!" She drew her lightsaber and ignited it. "You will never take this away from me!" From a ridge 1 click away, Jonan Hanks watched the conversation drag on. So far, Del and the Sith were only talking, but that wouldn't last. It couldn't. He gripped his binoculars so tightly that his knuckles cracked. "Del, you idiot," he hissed. "You're gonna get yourself killed," or taken hostage, which was in many ways worse. "Should I make the shot?" said the masked sniper next to him. If he gave the word, and the shot didn't drop her, then Dell was a dead man, and it would be on Jonin's shoulders. But if he waited too long, then the Sith might do the deed anyway. Even so, he had good reason to wait. Behind him, Rolls' starship made a hasty landing and deposited another clutch of militia and bounty hunters. Then without a sound, it lifted off to bring more. By talking, the Sith was giving Jonin more time to bring up his forces than he'd dared hope for. And if the opening shot did not kill the Sith, he'd need all the firepower he could get. "Wait for it," he said. On the other end of the binoculars, the Sith started to lose her composure, and Jonin's throat tightened. Then he saw a flare of livid red light. "Fire!" he said. Scylla sensed it a moment before it happened. She put her blade between herself and the window, and a fearsomely powerful blaster bolt smashed into her blade, reflected up into the roof, and seared a hole in the wood. Scylla threw one last glare at her father, but she would deal with him later. Out there was exactly what she wanted, an enemy for her to punish. With a figure-8 twirl of her lightsaber, she sawed a hole in the wall and leapt through it, into the blinding midday light. She had expected to see 5, maybe 10 Jedi waiting for her. Instead, there were dozens and dozens, and on closer look, they weren't Jedi. She saw soldiers in bulky, plated armor, scabby farmers and ranchers hefting ancient-looking blaster rifles, and even a pair of speeders with mounted weapons. They arranged themselves in a crescent around her, and the tips of the crescent were extending. Fools, she thought. Years ago, when her skills were not yet sharp, they would have had no trouble dispatching her, but they had come for her too late. Always, she had wanted to make the galaxy bleed, and now she would do it. She tilted into a sprint, and the first shots that came for her hit the air where she had been as she dashed for the edge of the formation. Much of Scylla's training days she had spent learning fencing from Nahus, or sparring with other knights in the pit. But to activate a training remote and practice blocking shots had long been a favorite pastime, and she had practiced until it was second nature. And the Sith had taught her the appropriate tactics to handle a mass of soldiers. She would line them up and never let them all engage her at once. With a force-empowered leap, she piled into a fire team on one of the spreading flanks, cutting down the lead man without effort. Blasters awkwardly aimed at her, and she deflected their shots easily as she zigzagged towards them. Rather than deflect their bolts back at them, which she had always found impractically difficult, she waited for an opening, skipped to one side, and lunged into the 4 soldiers in front of her. She twirled on her feet and heard the immensely satisfying searing noise of her blades cutting through flesh. 4 bodies fell at once. Those soldiers had been her cover, preventing the rest of the force from firing on her. It took her only a moment to find a new target, a hulking warrior of a species she had never seen before, setting up a repeating blaster. Once again, she charged at him in a crooked pattern, deflecting shots as she went, and whipped past the heavy warrior. One of her blades swiped the bipod of his gun out from underneath him, and as she slipped around him, her backhand blade caught him in the ankle. She kicked him, and he went sprawling into 2 other soldiers who rushed up to help. A pair of civilians ran at her, brandishing vibroblades, and Scylla welcomed the attack. She got between them, shielding herself from the other combatants. She spiraled around the 2 flailing idiots, ducking between them, always denying her enemies a clear shot. Eventually, she could not dodge the swing of the vibroblades and had to block instead, but then she effortlessly parried and drove the tip of her blade into the chest of one attacker. She leapt over the other with an ornate flip, and when she landed on the grass again, she flicked her lightsaber behind her. Whether she connected or not, she could not tell, and she did not take the time to see. There were more targets, more arrogant fools in need of a lesson. As she twirled to one side and batted away the few blaster bolts that came close to hitting her, she grinned monstrously and said, "I was born for this fight!" Carlota had never seen so much death. She had spent the last war in a classroom. Until today, she had been blessed never to witness battle, and now she watched men and women die by the dozen. The sparring ring had not prepared her for this. Keither charged down the line to meet the Sith, and that snapped Carlota out of her daze. She followed him, and he slowed a little to let her catch up so that they would engage the enemy together. The Sith faced a pair of militia members who fired on her with blaster pistols, and in a gap between shots, she pivoted her feet in preparation for a jump. The Jedi arrived just in time to stop her. Keither made a lunging thrust, using Makashi style, a good choice, and was wise enough not to overextend himself. The Sith parried, but if she had made a riposte it would have only hit air. But she did not counterattack, because Carlota pressed her from the opposite side, using a stable stance to launch the fastest sequence of attacks she could manage. Her strikes were excessive, frenetic, and ugly, but she did not concern herself with that. If she did not occupy the Sith's attention, then Keither was in danger, and that could not stand. The Sith made a flourish that caused both Jedi to step back, and with her opening she coiled in place and leapt into the air. The jump would have carried her halfway across the battlefield, but Carlota extended her left hand and called on the Force to pull her back. The pull was mostly successful, and the Sith's trajectory shortened. An arc of blaster bolts chased her through the air, and one of them nearly hit her, but sang as it bounced off her blade instead. The Sith landed and rolled, extinguishing her lightsaber before the roll and relighting it as soon as she regained her feet. Where she landed, she was not within striking distance of anyone, and a volley of blaster fire greeted her. She blocked and dodged, her form loosening as she struggled to keep up with the shots, and Carlota could sense her sudden fear. Before the Jedi could reach her, the Sith narrowly dodged a shot from the mounted weapon of one of the two speeders. The heavy shot slammed into the ground next to her, raising a cocktail of dust and charred chunks of dirt. With the shock of that near miss, the Sith seemed to gain focus, and she made another force-empowered leap into the speeder. There was a whirl of crimson as the vehicle was sliced to pieces. It took the Sith a moment to regain her bearings. A nearby militia woman scrambled back just in time to dodge a swing of her lightsaber, and the Sith had to surge forward to catch her with a second strike. In the time that took, Carlota and Keither were on her again. This time, the Sith whirled away from Carlota and focused on Keither. She threw a heart-stopping thrust and underhand strike at him, but he saw it coming and sidestepped. He counter-thrusted and very nearly ended the battle, but the Sith bent like a whip to avoid it and tumbled back to regain her balance. She flailed her blade at the incoming blaster fire and leapt between Carlota and Keither, a choice so unexpected that Carlota was almost not ready when the Sith threw a rolling sequence of attacks at her. But she was ready, and in a minute the Sith spun away from her and Keither, then leapt across the battlefield again. On landing, the outline of her hood tilted as she looked up, and Carlota followed her gaze to see Rolls' ship circling above her. Something occurred to Carlota, and Keither acted before she could speak the thought aloud. "Rolls!" he yelled into his communicator. "Don't get low! If you come too low, she'll board your ship!" Rolls stayed high. The side door of his ship popped open, and a few more bounty hunters poured shots down at the Sith. She ran for cover. Engaging the Jedi had been a bad idea. Scylla had hoped that the shooters would cease firing while she fenced with them, and they mostly had, but the two Jedi together were more than she could handle. The human Jedi had an unbreakable defense and was constantly getting in the way, which hindered the other Jedi and the shooters, but it hindered Scylla too. The Bothan was even trickier. His guard was weak, but he demanded her attention because his lunging thrusts could hit her from obscenely far away. It did not matter, though. This was a killing field, and as long as she stayed away from those Jedi, Scylla could do plenty of killing. As she leapt away from the two, she made sure to keep her angle low. It made avoiding blaster bolts harder, but it kept that blasted human Jedi from yanking her back with the Force. Ahead of her, a farm boy who'd been taking potshots at her froze up as he saw her coming, and in the blink of an eye, he was in 2 pieces. 3 bolts came at her from behind, all good shots but conveniently in a line, and she deflected them with 1 swing. She stepped back, which the shooters had not anticipated. She warded off a few lucky shots with her blade, and at the same time tackled a tough-looking woman who wore pouches and camouflage paint on what was otherwise standard Republic armor. A commando. The commando smashed her knee into Scylla's jaw, and when Scylla finally brought her lightsaber to bear and swung it where the commando had been, it hit nothing. The commando stood a few blade lengths in front of Scylla, aiming a pistol so that Scylla could see straight down the barrel. Shots poured from it, and she blocked them as best she could while fending off shots from other shooters at all angles. Then the commando reached for her belt, flicked her hand in front of her, and spread a sick-smelling white mist in the air between them. Shots came through the mist, and Scylla had to dodge because she did not know where to block. The commando was a hard target, and Scylla had no time for hard targets. She needed to stay ahead of the Jedi. Her path of destruction had brought her into the middle of a crowd, and that crowd had flowed to one side of her to reform into a crescent. Her eyes caught a concentration of shooters toward the edge of the arc, none looking especially wary, and Scylla had found her next victims. She surged at them, and they predictably panicked. Half of them scrambled out of the way to escape her spinning strike, and the other half fell dead. One of those who fled fired back at her with a few surprisingly accurate bolts from a pistol, and when she looked at him, he dodged out of her most convenient path of attack. She ignored him and swept her blade behind her, cutting into a few enemies she had not seen but had known were there. Scylla had found a vulnerable spot. The slowest and weakest enemies were here, and she wanted to stay here and slaughter them all. But the Jedi had almost caught up to her, and that infernal commando was in range too, looking like she had another surprise ready. Rather than face them, Scylla leapt onto the side of a boulder, and then leapt off it, rocketing across the battlefield and stopping just shy of a ridge where a few men and women with hunting rifles had been sniping at her. By lying prone, the snipers practically begged her to cut them in half, but Scylla wanted to keep her enemy guessing. Rather than stop to kill them, she vaulted over the ridge, over the snipers, and into the unsuspecting warriors behind. 2 of them fell dead instantly, and the others fled in panic, as they should have, except for one young Nikto man who got exactly 1 shot off before Scylla slashed into his chest. There was a cry of pain and anguish, and not from the young Nikto. It came from another, older Nikto who had been behind him, a militiaman with a broad-brimmed hat. A father. It would have been the simplest thing for Scylla to tear into him and leave him dead, but she chose to spare him. Maybe he'll kill himself out of grief, she thought. She liked that idea better. There were a few of the country trash militia who still had not gotten out of lunging distance, and with a twisting leap, she punished them for their foolishness. In a moment-long lull in the shooting, she drove one of her blades into the stomach of a dead-on-the-ground militiaman, purely so the rest of her enemies could see her do it. Her force sense told her something dire was coming from behind her, and she turned just in time to raise her lightsaber and block a massive shot from the mounted gun of the remaining speeder. The bolt slammed into the side of her blade and knocked her back, and the knuckles of her right hand seared with pain. Her fingers had not even been hit, but merely the heat surrounding the bolt had burned black scars into her skin. For the first time, she thought about escape. She would not be killing this entire army, that much was now clear. Unless that starship got within range, which didn't seem likely, the 1 speeder was the only thing fast enough to take her away from her pursuers. But she could not drive and defend herself at the same time. And her enemy seemed to know that the speeder was her only chance. They regrouped around it. They stood at convenient angles to fire on it in case she attacked, and there was even a passenger seated next to the driver who brandished a stun baton and seems to know how to use it. And the Jedi were coming. She had to keep moving. She leapt again, wincing against the growing soreness in her knees. When she landed, she roared, "I'm taking you all with me!" And by saying it, she felt that she just might be able to do it. Now that Carlota had room to think, terror gripped her. Civilians were dying, purely because she could not stop the Sith fast enough. They never should have been here, and she never should have given up control. "Keither, wait!" Carlota protested, as the two Jedi charged after the Sith. "We've got her on the run!" Keither yelled back. "Leave this to me," she wanted to say. "No one else can get hurt. We must stop this now. This has been a terrible mistake." She bit down on those words, but was unsure what to say instead. "We can stop her, Master. We only need to keep up the pressure." In front of them, the speeder released another giant blaster bolt, and the Sith dodged wildly to get out of the way. She survived, but she had been within an eye blink of death. An idea hit Carlota. It was an idea that did not appeal to her, but it seemed that it might work, and in the face of the horrors before her, that mattered more. "We do not need to chase her. We need to slow her down so the civilians can have an easier target." Keither lit up with understanding. "Shall we use a guarded pull?" "Yes, guard us, and I will pull." Carefully, they approached the Sith, stopped a few dozen feet short of her, and suited action to words. Keither stood in front of Carlota in a defensive posture, ready to protect his master, while Carlota extinguished her lightsaber, squared her stance, and opened herself to the Force. She gave herself to it. It gave itself back, and when the connection was pure, she reached out to the Sith, grabbed her lightsaber, and yanked it toward herself. Instantly, the Sith was pulled off balance. She held onto her weapon with panicked strength, tumbled, and nearly cut herself on her own blades. The next moment, she looked at the Jedi, coiled, and surged toward them. She aimed for Carlota, but Keither used a force push of his own to stop her short. She adapted and aimed for him, but he smoothly sidestepped her, covered himself with a retreating jab, and backpedaled away from her. The Sith started to give chase, but then seemed to change her mind and run the other way. She kept blocking the shots aimed at her, but her movements had become less crisp, and her legs carried her less quickly. Scylla did not know what to do. The shooters had gotten more careful to stay away from her, which made catching any of them difficult, and evading the Jedi was no longer as simple as jumping away from them. Instead of hounding after her, the Jedi had changed tactics to supporting the shooters. Now that they were working together, this fight would be a lot more difficult. A force push on her back sent her stumbling forward. She hopped a few feet to regain her bearings, turned, and spun her blade at a speed calculated to stop an arc of shots that blazed toward her. With a thrill of terror, she realized she had mistimed it. Pain stung her left thigh and exploded through her leg. She staggered and strained to keep moving as the shots became more precise. The pain made everything real to her. The prospect of dying here on this prairie now stared her in the face. "I don't want to die." The thought came unbidden, but even under fire she could not keep it out of her head. The romantic notion of taking a whole Republic army with her to the grave paled. And suddenly, the only thing in the universe that she wanted was to live. But surrender was out of the question. A lifetime in a cell would be nothing but a living death. She made another leap, this time favoring her right leg, and landed as smoothly as she could, but her left leg gave out, and she sank to one knee. She got to her feet as quickly as she could. The gunner on the land speeder scrambled to keep up with his target. When he'd been told they were hunting a Sith, he'd imagined a cloaked old man shooting lightning from his fingertips, or maybe a spy who would try to slink away rather than give them a fight. But this springy girl was not such an easy target. She landed after another of her big jumps, and he tried to anticipate in which direction she'd take off running. Instead, for some reason, she stayed put. His reticle passed over her, and he snapped off a shot. Keither ran past the speeder just in time to see it. One moment, the Sith was recovering from a botched landing. The next, she erupted in light and smoke, and the force of it threw her like a toy. "Did we get her?" came the inevitable question from somewhere in the militia. But none of them were foolish enough to approach. It took a moment for the smoke and airborne dust to clear away. But when it did, Keither saw that the Sith lay still, having hit the ground hard enough to leave an impression in the dirt. Smoke rose from her stomach where the speeder's cannon had made a direct hit. It was some surprise that she hadn't been blown to pieces. Her face was frozen in a permanent flinch, as if she'd seen the hit coming. "It's over," said Master Stritt numbly. She keyed in her communicator and repeated, "It's over, Sheriff. The Sith has rejoined the Force." "Is she dead?" "Yes." Faced with the sight of a corpse, Keither felt the habitual urge to heal her, to assess her chances of survival and judge how to save her. But that was absurd. Even if she were not already dead, the battlefield was littered with bodies far more deserving of help than her. Keither turned around. "Wounded!" he yelled. "Bring me your wounded! I can heal them!" He switched on his own communicator. "Rolls! Prepare the emergency room, now!" A heartbeat later, Rolls' ship thumped down onto the ground next to him, and the door hissed open. "Already on it, boss! Just line 'em up!" As Keither started his search for wounded, he felt oddly comfortable. Battle was a stranger to him, but the aftermath suited his skills perfectly. He ran through the crowd of dazed warriors, yelling, "Bring out your wounded! Bring them to the ship!" Sheriff Hanks got in Keither's way, and the two almost collided. Keither stopped, not to avoid him, but because he was struck by the look of panic in the sheriff's eye. "Keither," said the sheriff, "my son, he needs your help! This way!" Keither knew that look, and coming from the sheriff, it filled him with worry. He followed him to find the deputy, Jonan Hanks, lying on his back with a red-brown cut across his chest. He did not look good. First glance told him that the patient was in shock at the very least, and depending on where a Nikto's lungs and heart were, they could have been hit too. A flesh wound would have been easy, but when the vitals were damaged, such patients were difficult to save. There was nothing to do but try. Kneeling beside him, he put a hand on the patient's chest, closed his eyes, and sought the patient's life force. It was there, and it was fighting to keep living. Keither honed his focus, found the pain and the damage in the flesh that remained, and he willed it to regenerate. Cells multiplied. The canyon that had been cut into the patient's chest became narrower and finally closed. Under the wide gash in his shirt, the skin met, and all that remained was a dark burn scar running across his chest. Keither heard the patient's breathing as a ragged scraping sound, then a choked whisper. But then something seemed to catch, and his chest rose and fell smoothly. The patient turned his head. His eyes eased open. "Sheriff?" was the first word out of his mouth. "What happened?" Sheriff Hanks worked his jaw, a smile spreading across his face. He put a hand on Keither's shoulder, and through tears he said, "Son, this man just saved your life." "You're welcome," said Keither. "Now I must help the others." And he sprinted off.